In the summer of 1942, far beyond the familiar battlefields of Europe, a silent struggle unfolded in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, the Arctic Ocean, an expanse of freezing winds, drifting pack ice, and unbroken daylight, became the unlikely stage for one of the most daring and dangerous logistical lifelines of the Second World War. Few civilians ever knew the full cost of these Arctic convoys, but to the men who sailed them, their names, PQ and QP, were etched into memory like scars. And among them, Convoy PQ-17 would soon become synonymous with disaster. On June 27, 1942, the ships of PQ-17 slipped out of Valfjordur, Iceland. 35 merchant vessels formed the convoy's core, carrying the armored heartbeat of Allied support for the Soviet Union. Sherman tanks, Hawker Hurricane aircraft, jeeps, ammunition, and fuel, lifelines needed to sustain the Eastern Front against Hitler's relentless advance. Escorting them was a formidable array of Royal Navy vessels, destroyers like HMS Keppel, corvettes, sloops, submarines, and a distant covering force that included cruisers and battleships poised to counter any threat from the German capital ships lurking in Norway. To an outside observer, the departure might have seemed almost routine, but to those aboard, tensions simmered from the moment the convoy entered open waters. German reconnaissance aircraft had grown increasingly active over the northern sea routes, and the shadow of the Kriegsmarine's most feared giant, the battleship Tirpitz, hung over every mile of the journey. Sailors whispered the ship's name in mess halls and shared rumors that it had already begun moving. The mere possibility of the Tirpitz setting sail was enough to send shivers through even the most seasoned crews. They knew the math. No escort, no matter how capable, could guarantee survival if the 42,000-ton battleship and its escorting cruisers emerged from their Norwegian fjords. As the convoy progressed, day and night ceased to exist. The Arctic summer sun washed the sky in a pale, endless glow. There was no darkness to hide in, no respite from constant watchfulness. Ice floes drifted through the sea lanes, forcing ships to thread cautiously between them. Even in calm weather, temperatures hovered low enough to crust decks in frost by morning. One sailor aboard a British freighter later wrote in his diary, "The cold creeps into your bones and never leaves. You sleep with it, wake with it, and work with it. The sea itself feels alive, like it wants to swallow the unwary." Yet despite the conditions, the convoy moved with disciplined purpose. Ships maintained tight formation. Gunners stood ready at their Oerlikon and Bofors cannons. Lookouts scanned the skies for the telltale glint of a Luftwaffe bomber. Every man understood the stakes. Lose the route, and the Soviet front could collapse. But as the days passed, a growing unease spread among the convoy escorts. Reports filtered in that German reconnaissance aircraft were increasing in number, as if plotting something larger than usual. The Admiralty, too, monitored radio decrypts indicating that German naval forces in Norway were preparing a possible sortie. On July 2nd, the pressure escalated. Luftwaffe Ju-88 bombers and torpedo aircraft swooped in from the south, launching aggressive scouting attacks. Although only minor damage was inflicted, the intent was unmistakable. The Germans were probing defenses. What the escort commanders did not know was that German intelligence had significantly overestimated the convoy's armament load and was pushing for a decisive strike. Meanwhile, in London, the Admiralty wrestled with a harrowing uncertainty. Ultra-intelligence suggested that Tirpitz, accompanied by the heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper and Admiral Scheer, might enter the Arctic at any moment. The thought of such a force descending upon PQ-17's merchant ships was a nightmare scenario. The convoy commander, Commodore Jack Broom, kept morale calm, but his own notes reveal the truth. Every hour spent in these waters feels borrowed. We do not know if the hunters are coming. As PQ-17 approached the ice edge and entered the most dangerous stretch of its route, the escorts prepared for the possibility of a major engagement. The distant covering force, comprising some of the Royal Navy's most powerful vessels, remained hundreds of miles away, positioned to intercept if the Germans struck in strength. Yet that distance also meant that the convoy itself could be exposed before help arrived. For the moment, though, PQ-17 still held together. Ships steamed in disciplined lines, and morale, though strained, remained intact. But in the quiet moments, questions lingered. Questions about intelligence, about German intentions, and about how long the escorts could protect the vulnerable merchantmen if the storm finally broke. And as July 3 turned to July 4, a new set of signals began to arrive. Messages that would soon trigger the most controversial order in the history of the Arctic convoys and seal the fate of many ships that vanished into the cold, indifferent waters of the Barents Sea. The disaster had not yet begun, but its shadow had already fallen over PQ-17. By the morning of July 4, 1942, Convoy PQ-17 had entered a stretch of the Arctic where the margin for error was razor-thin. The sea was deceptively calm, a glassy gray surface, broken only by drifting ice. But beneath that calm lay a rising tide of fear. Fear rooted in one name: Tirpitz. For weeks, British intelligence had warned that the German battleship might be preparing to strike northward. Now, reports filtered into the Admiralty, suggesting the massive warship and her escorts were leaving their Norwegian anchorage. Though the information was incomplete, it was enough to trigger alarm throughout the British command structure. Among the escort commanders at sea, the atmosphere was tense, but not yet desperate. Commodore Jack Broom's notes from the day reveal an attempt to maintain calm routine aboard the convoy. Gunners conducted drills. Lookouts remained sharp. Wireless operators monitored coded transmissions. But Broom could not ignore the worrying pattern of Luftwaffe activity overhead. More Ju-88s appeared that morning, flying higher, staying longer, circling the convoy like patient predators. It was reconnaissance behavior, not attack, and reconnaissance meant something larger was coming. At 21:11 London time, the Admiralty issued the first of a series of signals that would shape the tragedy to come. Cruiser force to withdraw to the westward at high speed. Admiral Hamilton's covering force, powerful cruisers meant to intercept Tirpitz, turned away from the convoy. It was a move driven by fear of surface engagement with the German squadron, but for the merchantmen of PQ-17, it also meant losing the deep layer protection of heavy ships. For now, the escorts still believed the convoy would continue as planned. That illusion shattered less than 2 hours later. At 22:15, a new message arrived from the Admiralty. It was short, blunt, and devastating. Convoy is to scatter. The words struck like a physical blow. Scatter? In the Arctic? With U-boats already prowling and bombers shadowing above. To sailors who understood the risks, the order felt suicidal. Convoy survived by staying together. Massed anti-aircraft guns, shared lookouts, coordinated defense. Scattering meant isolation. It meant vulnerability. It meant each ship for itself. But the Admiralty's decision-makers believed the Tirpitz was minutes from launching an attack. If the German battleship truly approached, No amount of escort protection could save a tightly grouped convoy. Scattering, they thought, might allow some ships to slip away through the ice. Commodore Broome was stunned. He wrote later, "I had not expected a possibility so catastrophic, nor one that would be carried out with no final confirmation." Yet the signal was unambiguous. He ordered his ships to break formation. In moments, the tight, disciplined structure of the convoy dissolved. Ships that had spent days maintaining precise distances began turning away in all directions. Some headed east toward the ice edge, believing it safer to hug the floes. Others turned south, hoping speed might carry them from the anticipated German attack. A few captains disobeyed unofficially, choosing to follow nearby ships rather than plunge into the Arctic alone. But nothing could hide the reality. PQ-17, once a formidable formation, was now a scattered collection of isolated targets in hostile waters. The destroyers and corvettes left behind faced their own grim orders. Most were instructed to leave the merchant ships and fall back. Withdraw to the westward meant abandoning the very vessels they had sworn to protect. Many captains hesitated, looking out at freighters already steaming away in fear and confusion. But in war, hesitation could not override command. One by one, the escorts turned their bows westward, leaving the convoy behind. From the air, the sight must have been almost surreal. A German reconnaissance pilot later recounted seeing merchant ships peeling away like a flock of startled birds, scattering across miles of open ocean. To the Luftwaffe, it was a gift. Where once they faced a single, heavily defended target, they now saw dozens of isolated ships, each one slow, alone, and exposed. To the men aboard the merchant vessels, the experience was harrowing. Many crews had never sailed independently in hostile waters. Gunners scanned the empty horizon, knowing U-boats would soon close in. Some ships shut off radios entirely, hoping silence might offer safety. Others transmitted frantic questions. Where is the enemy? What direction should we take? But no clear answers came back. The psychological shift was immediate and profound. Minutes earlier, these sailors had been part of a powerful convoy. Now, each vessel felt abandoned. A British deck officer aboard the freighter River Afton later wrote, "We were no longer a convoy. We were bait." The full weight of the decision would not be felt until the night deepened and the first torpedo wakes cut through the Arctic waters. The Germans had not only found scattered targets, they found opportunity. And as the first explosions echoed across the Barents Sea, the question that would haunt historians for decades took shape. Had the Admiralty reacted to real danger or phantom signals? For the men of PQ-17, the answer no longer mattered. What mattered now was survival. Night came slowly in the Arctic summer, the endless sun dimming but never truly setting, casting the scattered remains of convoy PQ-17 into a pale, dreamlike twilight. But for the men aboard the merchant ships, what unfolded between July 4th and July 5th was no dream. It was the beginning of a systematic hunt, one carried out with chilling efficiency by U-boats, Luftwaffe bombers, and the unrelenting cold of the Barents Sea. As the convoy dissolved into the vast emptiness, its vessels became solitary silhouettes on a frozen canvas, each one an isolated target. The first to fall was the American freighter SS Christopher Newport. She had broken away from the main group shortly after the scatter order, steaming eastward in hopes of using the drifting ice as partial cover. Her crew had gone to full alert. Deck guns were manned, lifeboats checked, and lookouts positioned at every vantage point. But at 1 o'clock on July 5th, as she threaded through a patch of loose floes, the dark shape of a U-boat emerged from the shadows. Kapitän-Leutnant Siegfried Strelo of U-457 had been tracking the scattered vessels for hours, waiting for the moment to strike. The torpedo hit without warning. A shattering explosion tore through the hull near the bow, sending a column of water and debris into the air. The blast extinguished the ship's forward lights instantly. Survivors later recalled hearing cries through the smoke-filled air, the screech of metal giving way, and the overwhelming shock of freezing seawater rushing across the deck. The bow sank rapidly, dragging the ship down by the front as men scrambled to free the lifeboats. Within minutes, the Christopher Newport was crippled, an agonizing symbol of what the scatter order had unleashed. Word of the attack never reached most of the other ships. Radio silence was the unofficial norm now. Transmissions risked revealing positions. In the confusion, each captain made isolated decisions, hoping instinct and luck would succeed where strategy had collapsed. Some vessels edged closer to the ice, believing U-boats would be hesitant to approach. Others went full speed into open waters, but no direction offered safety. By dawn, the Luftwaffe arrived. Ju-88 bombers from Kampfgeschwader 30 roared in low over the steel-gray waters, their engines echoing across the unbroken horizon. Without the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of a convoy, each ship's solitary guns were hopelessly outmatched. The British freighter SS Navarino, heavily laden with tanks and ammunition, was among the first spotted that morning. The aircraft swooped in, dropping bombs that engulfed the deck in fire. Flames raced towards her cargo holds. The crew, realizing the danger, abandoned ship before the fire reached the ammunition crates. Minutes later, an explosion lit the sky like a sunrise, and the Navarino sank beneath the waves. These attacks were not random. German reconnaissance had identified the scattered routes of multiple ships. U-boats coordinated with the Luftwaffe, closing in on likely escape paths. For the sailors aboard PQ-17's merchantmen, the hunt felt relentless, almost suffocating. Every shadow on the horizon, every ripple in the water, seemed to signal another enemy move. A British seaman aboard the freighter HMS Bolton Castle later wrote in his journal, "It was as if the ocean itself had turned hostile. We saw nothing, no escorts, no fellow ships, only sky and water. The enemy could have been anywhere." His words captured the psychological weight of those hours. Isolation magnified fear. The absence of a fleet meant no reassurance, no confirmation that others fought the same silent battle. Even so, acts of bravery marked the night. Gunners fired at silhouettes that darted across the clouds, forcing some Luftwaffe aircraft to abort their runs. Crews worked tirelessly to patch holes, steady engines, and keep ships moving. But bravery alone could not offset the tactical disadvantage. The Arctic had become a battlefield in which every mistake was fatal, and every minute of survival was borrowed time. Amid the chaos, questions began to haunt the captain of nearly every vessel. Why had the Admiralty ordered the convoy to scatter so abruptly? Where was Tirpitz? Had the feared German battleship actually set sail? Rumors spread across different ships like whispered ghosts. Some claimed to have seen smoke on the horizon. Others insisted they had intercepted coded German signals. But in truth, none of them knew, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on the crews. The mystery deepened when several ships vanished without any clear record of their final moments. Some were believed to have been torpedoed in the night, swallowed quickly by the sea. Others may have struck ice. A few simply stopped transmitting and were never heard from again. For decades after the war, historians pieced together fragments of logs, survivor testimonies, and German naval records to reconstruct what likely happened. Yet some losses remain unclear, shrouded in the shifting fog of Arctic warfare. By the end of July 5, PQ-17 was no longer a convoy in any meaningful sense. It was a scattering of battered survivors struggling across hundreds of miles of ocean, each ship bracing for attacks it could not predict and had little hope of surviving. And with the Luftwaffe tracking targets through the unbroken daylight, the next wave of destruction was already forming on the horizon, ready to hunt down more Allied ships that now sailed blind into danger. By July 5th's end, the once unified formation of Convoy PQ-17 had become a vast constellation of desperate vessels scattered across hundreds of miles of the Barents Sea. The Arctic sun still hung above the horizon, unblinking and merciless, ensuring there would be no darkness in which these ships could hide. With every hour of continuous daylight, the German advantage sharpened. What followed from July 5th to July 8th, 1942, was not merely a battle, it was a dismantling. One ship at a time, methodically, relentlessly. The British freighter SS Weimaraner, renowned for her speed and carrying fuel and ammunition, became one of the Luftwaffe's prime targets. On July 6th, a formation of Ju-88s from KG-30 spotted her alone, steaming at full speed southward. Her gunners fought with extraordinary courage, knocking one bomber out of the sky and damaging another. But even the fastest cargo ship could not outrun an air attack. Bombs struck her midships, igniting the volatile cargo. A survivor would later describe the deck as a rolling inferno, with flames rising higher than the masts. When the ship exploded, it did so with a force that briefly stunned the attacking pilots. Farther east, the American SS Daniel Morgan was locked in a deadly cat-and-mouse game with U-boats. She had been attempting to maneuver near the ice edge, hoping the shifting flows might force submarines to keep their distance. But U-88, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Heino Bowman, tracked her steadily. On July 7th, just before midday, Bowman seized an opening. A single torpedo struck beneath the engine room, crippling the ship instantly. The crew abandoned her in minutes, rowing lifeboats into an ocean strewn with ice fragments sharp as blades. For hours they drifted, listening to distant explosions as other ships met similar fates. Elsewhere in the convoy's disintegrating footprint, the British ship SS Empire Byron fought a losing battle against both sea and sky. Struck once on July 4 and again on July 6th, she limped forward with her decks riddled by splinters and her pumps struggling to contain flooding. A third attack, by the omnipresent Ju-88s, finished her. Survivors recalled the eerie silence just before she capsized, only the crackle of burning debris and the hiss of water swallowing the wreck. But the harshest blows came from the coordinated air-sea assaults that defined these days. The Luftwaffe would flush out a merchant ship from the air, driving it into the path of U-boats waiting for the kill. This deadly synergy proved catastrophic for ships like the SS Pan-Atlantic and SS John Witherspoon. Both were carrying essential supplies, aircraft parts, ammunition, vehicles. Both were isolated, defenseless, and exhausted. And both disappeared beneath the Barents Sea within hours of being detected, one sunk by torpedoes, the other by relentless bombing. It was during this period that the sheer scale of chaos became fully apparent to the Allied command. Reports came in sporadically, fragmented signals intercepted by radio operators, or delivered by exhausted survivors reaching Soviet ports. Many ships did not report at all. Some were believed sunk. Others were missing entirely. The convoy's operational picture had disintegrated as thoroughly as its physical formation. For the men fighting to survive, the psychological strain was immense. The Arctic environment itself seemed to conspire against them. Thick fog settled in patches, giving hope of concealment, but also disorienting crews, making navigation treacherous. Ice drifted unpredictably. Lifeboats, once launched, were at the mercy of a sea cold enough to kill in minutes. One sailor later wrote that the fog felt like a shroud pulled across the face of every man who looked into it. Amid the suffering, questions about the Admiralty's decision grew increasingly bitter. Rumors reached the ships, rumors that Tirpitz had never left its fjord, that the feared surface attack had never materialized. If true, these whispered claims implied that the convoy had been abandoned due to a phantom threat. The men could not know the full truth yet, but doubt had already taken root. By July 8th, the disaster was undeniable. Of the 35 merchant ships that had departed Iceland, most were now sunk or missing. Only a handful had managed to evade the hunters and press on towards Soviet waters. These survivors bore the weight of both hope and guilt, the knowledge that hundreds of comrades were dead or drifting in lifeboats somewhere behind them. The remains of PQ-17 were still not safe, but the worst had already unfolded. With the Luftwaffe's attacks slowing and some submarine forces shifting position, the survivors sailed into a quieter but still deadly sea. Though they did not yet know it, the losses of these days would make PQ-17 the greatest convoy disaster of the Arctic War, its vanished ships destined to become the ocean's secrets. Yet 5 specific merchantmen, each carrying crucial cargo, would come to symbolize the mystery of PQ-17's fate. Their stories and their disappearance would haunt Allied memory for decades. In the aftermath of PQ-17's collapse, the Barents Sea became a graveyard of steel, oil, and unanswered questions. Among the dozens of vessels that met their fate during those chaotic days, 5 merchant ships in particular came to embody the haunting mystery of the convoy's destruction. Their stories, fragmented, harrowing, and sometimes incomplete, offer a window into the confusion that engulfed the Allied effort as ships vanished one by one into the freezing Arctic. These ships were the SS Christopher Newport, SS William Hopper, SS Daniel Morgan, SS Pan Atlantic, and SS John Witherspoon. Their journeys, though brief, reflected both the courageous determination of their crews and the unforgiving environment that consumed them. The SS Christopher Newport, already crippled in the early hours of July 5th, lingered as a floating wreck for several hours after the first torpedo hit her. Smoke drifted thickly over the water, making her silhouette difficult to interpret from a distance. Some ships reported seeing her aflame. Others claimed she appeared to be still afloat, listing heavily. The Luftwaffe resolved the ambiguity. Later that afternoon, a German aircraft returned to the scene and placed a bomb directly into her stern. The explosion broke her remaining structural integrity, sending what was left of the ship sliding beneath the waterline. The precise moment of her sinking went unrecorded, a sign of the convoy's disintegration. For decades, historians pieced together the sequence of attacks from survivor statements and German mission logs, but the details remain partly speculative. The SS William Hopper, another American Liberty ship, faced a similar fate. Carrying tanks and trucks destined for the Soviet front, She had attempted to escape southward, but after the scatter order, she found herself without escort, isolated and running at full speed. On July 6th, German aircraft located her, circling high above as they coordinated their attack run. The bombs that struck her were devastating, igniting fuel reserves on deck. Flames erupted in towering sheets. Several crew members survived long enough to launch lifeboats, but many were lost when the burning ship's cargo detonated minutes later. No comprehensive radio message was sent before she vanished. Her last known coordinates were logged by an escort destroyer that glimpsed her smoke on the horizon, a sight followed by a dull explosion. The hopper's remains never surfaced again. The SS Daniel Morgan's story was better documented, though still tragic. As one of the few ships attempting to skirt the northern ice edge, she held out longer than most. Her captain believed that using the ice as cover might allow the ship to sneak through to Soviet waters. But U-boats rarely took risks in the Arctic. They followed patiently, took advantage of predictable currents, and waited for the perfect moment. When U-88 fired its torpedo into the Morgan, the explosion was so sudden that the ship barely had time to signal distress. She went down quickly, but several lifeboats survived, drifting among the ice until Soviet patrols eventually recovered a handful of half-frozen survivors days later. For many in the Allied command, the Morgan became a symbol of the convoy's bravery, isolated but defiant until the end. The SS Pan-Atlantic was one of the convoy's more heavily laden vessels, carrying ammunition, explosives, and military supplies crucial to the Soviet war effort. Her disappearance remains among the least understood of the five. Some German logs suggest she was sunk by aerial bombing on July 7th. Others imply she may have been torpedoed later that night. No survivors ever reported her final moments, and no lifeboats attributed to the Pan-Atlantic were confirmed. Theories emerged after the war that she may have detonated catastrophically during an air attack, leaving little trace. What is known for certain is that her loss was one of the most material economically. Her cargo represented months of American industrial effort. Finally, the SS John Witherspoon carried aircraft components and ammunition, items desperately needed on the Eastern Front. She was attacked repeatedly during the days after PQ-17 scattered. A Luftwaffe bombing run on July 6th caused severe damage, setting her holds ablaze. The crew fought the fire for hours, desperately attempting to save the ship. Their efforts bought time, but not salvation. Later that day, U-255 delivered a torpedo that sealed her fate. As she went down, several crew members recorded the final assault in terse, hurried entries, notes later found in their pockets when they were rescued. These fragments offered rare insight into the chilling final minutes aboard a doomed Liberty ship. For each of these vessels, mystery lingers, not because their fates are entirely unknown, but because the chaos of PQ-17 ensured few events were witnessed clearly or recorded precisely. Ships disappeared into fog, smoke, and ice. Torpedo tracks were seen moments before impact. Attack aircraft descended suddenly from cloud cover. Survivors drifted for days, their accounts shaped by trauma and exhaustion. Even after the war ended, conflicting reports persisted. Soviet recovery logs contradicted British naval records. German U-boat diaries offered details, but sometimes misidentified targets. Together, the stories of these 5 ships, lost swiftly, violently, and in isolation, became emblematic of a deeper question. How could such destruction unfold so completely, so quickly, and with so little clarity? As the last ships of PQ-17 struggled toward Soviet ports, those questions hung heavily over the survivors. They did not yet know, as Part 6 would reveal, that their ordeal would fundamentally reshape Allied strategy and spark one of the most controversial inquiries of the entire war. By the time the surviving remnants of Convoy PQ-17 reached the Soviet ports of Archangels and Molodovsk, the Arctic sun had already exposed the full magnitude of the disaster. Only 11 of the original 35 merchant ships completed the journey. The others, 24 vessels carrying tanks, trucks, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and the hopes of the Eastern Front, were gone. Their crews, exhausted and frostbitten, stepped onto Soviet docks as hollow-eyed survivors of an ordeal that would soon spark one of the most contentious debates of the entire war. Yet as they limped ashore, one question loomed larger than all others. Why had they been scattered? The Soviet authorities, hardened by months of grinding warfare on the Eastern Front, were stunned. They had expected a staggering amount of material, well over 150,000 tons. Instead, they received less than a tenth of what had been promised. Within hours of the survivors' arrival, cables shot back to London and Washington, each demanding explanations. Meanwhile, the British Admiralty, already aware that the convoy had been savaged, braced for the political shockwave. But explanations would not come easily. Intelligence reports, wartime fears, and a cascade of misinterpretations had collided in ways that produced tragedy on an unprecedented scale. The heart of the controversy lay in a single assumption: the belief that the German battleship Tirpitz had set sail to intercept the convoy. For the British Admiralty, Tirpitz represented not just a ship, but a nightmare scenario. She was one of the most powerful battleships afloat, heavily armored, heavily armed, and positioned strategically in Norwegian fjords. For months, her mere presence had threatened Allied convoys. If she reached PQ-17, no escort could guarantee survival. And so, when intelligence hinted at her possible movement, the Admiralty reacted with the utmost caution. Yet the truth emerged slowly. The feared sortie never happened. Tirpitz and her escorts remained within their fjords, never closing in on the convoy. The Admiralty's decision to order the convoy to scatter, made on the basis of incomplete intelligence, now seemed disastrously premature. Critics within the Royal Navy questioned how such a drastic command could be issued without definitive confirmation of the threat. The official inquiry would later conclude that the Admiralty acted on the best information it had at the time, but that its interpretation of that information had been overly pessimistic. The result was an order that removed the convoy's core defense: cohesion. For the crews who had survived, the debate felt painfully detached from their lived experience. Many sailors described feeling abandoned, betrayed, or sacrificed in the name of caution. The captain of one surviving Liberty ship later recalled the moment the scatter order came through. "We couldn't believe it. We thought they must know something we didn't. But as the days passed, we wondered if anyone knew anything at all." His sentiment echoed across dozens of survivor accounts. These men had watched comrades drown, freeze, or burn. They had drifted in lifeboats for days. And they returned not to celebration, but to questions they struggled to answer themselves. Soviet officers, after helping the survivors recover, pressed for clarity. To them, PQ-17's decimation was more than a tragedy. It was a strategic failure with immediate consequences. Without the expected armor and supplies, Red Army units suffered delays in resupply along key sectors of the Northern Front. Although PQ convoys eventually resumed with stronger escort arrangements and improved intelligence coordination, the shadow of PQ-17 lingered long afterward. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill called the convoy's loss one of the most melancholy episodes in the whole war, a rare moment of blunt acknowledgement. Behind the scenes, operational protocols began to shift. Intelligence assessments were tightened. Naval commanders were granted more discretion regarding on-scene decisions. And for months afterward, Arctic convoys were suspended entirely, leaving the Soviet Union temporarily cut off from one of its most vital supply routes. Yet, for all its immediate repercussions, the story of PQ-17 carried a deeper legacy. It became a case study in the dangers of uncertainty. Historians later emphasized that the Arctic convoys required not only courage, but precision. A single flawed assumption, magnified by distance, isolation, and the unforgiving environment, could unravel even the most carefully planned operation. Decades later, when divers and researchers located wrecks of several PQ-17 ships, the findings offered closure to some families, but many mysteries persisted. Some vessels had sunk so quickly that their final moments remained undocumented. Others drifted far from their last reported positions, carried by unpredictable Arctic currents before disappearing beneath layers of silt. The sea, indifferent and impenetrable, had preserved parts of the story while erasing others. What remained was the human record, diary fragments found in lifeboats, survivor testimonies etched into post-war archives, handwritten notes discovered in oil-soaked uniforms. These pieces, fragile yet powerful, preserved the memory of those who had endured the Arctic hellscape and those who had not. In the end, the lasting lesson of PQ-17 was neither strategic nor political. It was human. The convoy's fate underscored the limits of command, the price of misjudgment, and the resilience of ordinary sailors thrust into extraordinary hardship. Their ordeal became a somber chapter in the history of Allied cooperation and a reminder of the perilous road to victory. And even now, when historians recount the Arctic convoys, they pause at the name PQ-17. Its story is not newly one of ships lost, but of lives interrupted, decisions questioned, and mysteries carried to the ocean floor, where 5 lost ships still lie, undisturbed, beneath the cold Arctic silence.